for our first official meeting of the book club. Before we get started, just a few announcements. So you hopefully have seen, as we've been coming in, a few announcements posted up. The first really important thing is that there's now a website available for the book club. So there you can find recordings and announcement and links. So the link to that will be put in the chat. Renee or Sarah will be sending it out. You should also see some links in the chat for different ways to engage with and support the Department of Ancient Greek and Roman Studies at Berkeley. We have the ongoing Say Their Lecture series this semester, and we have an event on February 4th on AI and the Library of Alexandria and the Age of Artificial Intelligence. That's next Wednesday. You can also support the Department of Ancient Greek and Roman Studies at the Big Give on March 12th. And another way you can support the department is by reading and sharing different articles that we'll be sending out every so often, where you can share exciting research that's happening in the department. So different links will be coming around in the chat. Stay tuned for those. Another announcement is that today we'll have, for the first time, our breakout rooms. So at 6:30, we'll break our hour-long discussion, and you'll have an opportunity to choose a different room to go into and talk more with some of the other participants. So we hope that you'll join us for that. Before I turn it over to our faculty discussion lead today, I thought it could be useful just to take us through a brief summary of what we read, get us all refreshed on books 1 through 4. So books 1 through 4, as you might have noticed, these focus not on our main figure of Odysseus, but rather life back home on Ithaca. In book 1, after the proem, we dart quickly up to Mount Olympus, where we see a meeting of the gods. Everyone is there except for the god Poseidon. Athena and her father Zeus decide that they'll bring Odysseus home at last, even though Poseidon is very angry with him. So they dispatch Hermes to Calypso's island to get Odysseus. We'll pick up with that storyline later. And meanwhile, Athena jumps down to Ithaca to find Telemachus. When she finds Telemachus, and she's in the disguise of a man named Mentes, he's sitting in the halls, surrounded by the suitors having these outrageous feasts. So she instructs him, expel the suitors and go on your own journey. Go to Pylos and go to Sparta and find out more about your father. We also see the song of Phemius, a bard in the halls. He sings the story of the homecoming of the Achaeans, which causes Penelope to weep. In book 2, we see Telemachus call an assembly of the Ithacans, an assembly that hasn't happened in 20 years since Odysseus left for Troy. There he says, please help me. Let's expel the suitors from my halls. But he's mainly met with dissent from the suitors themselves. He only receives the support of Mentor and Halicertes, a seer, who actually interprets an omen that occurs during the assembly. 2 eagles fly and start tearing at each other's faces. And Halicertes interprets this as an omen for Odysseus's homecoming. Now at an impasse with the suitors, Telemachus declares that he will depart for Pylos and begins to make preparations for his departure. He only tells his nurse Eurycleia that he's leaving and tells her not to tell his mother. Books 3 and 4 follow that journey, where Telemachus goes first to Pylos and then to Sparta, together with Athena, now disguised as Mentor. When they arrive on Pylos, the 2 of them, they find that the Pelians are sacrificing to the god Poseidon. Nestor and his sons welcome them, receive them, invite them to take part in the sacrificial feast. When Telemachus asks Nestor about his father, He's not able to tell him what happened to Odysseus. He only knows a certain point, but he does tell him about his own homecoming and that of some other men. He instructs him instead to go to Menelaus in Sparta to get more information and gives him a chariot to go there and sends his own son, Pisistratus, with him. Telemachus and Pisistratus arrive in Sparta in Book 4, and they find that the community is celebrating two weddings, one for Menelaus' son, Megapenthes, and one for his daughter, Hermione. Both Menelaus and Helen are immediately struck by Telemachus's resemblance to the son of Odysseus or to Odysseus himself, and this is something that you might have observed Nestor felt in the previous book. Prompted by this amazement at his appearance, Pisistratus reveals that he is in fact Telemachus, the son of Odysseus, and all of them weep. Afterwards, Helen puts a drug into their wine that makes them lose the possibility of pain, and then launches into a story of one of Odysseus's exploits at Troy when he entered the city in disguise on a reconnaissance mission. Afterwards, Menelaus recounts the story of Odysseus in the Trojan horse. In the morning, Menelaus tells Telemachus about his own homecoming, and includes a story about meeting the shapeshifter Proteus, who tells him about Odysseus's current state. It turns out Odysseus is alive on the island of Calypsos and is being held there. Meanwhile, back in Ithaca, the suitors are laying in wait, preparing to ambush and kill Telemachus. When Penelope hears of this, she's extremely distraught and is only soothed once Athena comes to her in the form of her sister and tells her that Telemachus will have a smooth homecoming. But when she asks further, surely this dream must be a goddess, to tell her about Odysseus, Athena refuses. She can't know anymore. So we're left here at the end of book 4 with Telemachus's homecoming still not having been completed, and Odysseus's hasn't either. So with that backdrop, I'd like to now introduce our faculty guest, Professor Leslie Kurke, who we're lucky to have with us for the second time already. Professor Leslie Kurke is the Gladys Rayhard Wood Chair and Distinguished Professor of Ancient Greek and Roman Studies and Comparative Literature, affiliate faculty in the Department of Gender and Women's Studies, and chair of the Department of Ancient Greek and Roman Studies. She has been teaching at UC Berkeley since 1990. Professor Kurke has spent much of her research life working on ancient Greek literature and cultural history, with special emphasis on archaic Greek poetry and its social context. Herodotus in early prose, ancient Greek popular culture, the constitution of ideology through material practices, and the interactions of performed poetry and architectural space. Each of her 4 earlier books, Traffic in
Cecily,
Praise.
Cecily, don't do all that.
Oh, okay.
We don't need to do all that.
Okay.
Because I'm champing at the bit to get to the Odyssey.
Okay, great. So with us, Professor Kurke.
Thank you. I'm sorry, I have no overhead light, so the lighting is very bizarre. It's not intentional, and I'm sorry about that. But so you can just listen. And thank you, Cecily, for the summary. And I was also just going to pick up with Cecily's excellent presentation last time on the Pro-Am, which was so fantastic. That remember the first word, andra, a man. The weird fact that we don't get Odysseus named in the Pro-Am. It takes a really long time for Odysseus to get named, and even Telemachus just never uses his name. And we wait 4 books, and we still haven't even met Odysseus. Somebody sent a question about that, which I hope to get to in a while. And I hope to get to a couple of the other questions that were sent in the course of the things that I want to talk about. Let me say there were a couple of questions about translation. Gunnar's question. Unfortunately, I checked with Cecily. Neither of us has ever read the Fagles translation, so we can't talk about it. But you can ask other presenters, maybe somebody has a view on it. There was also a question from Harry about some Facebook article, which I haven't read because I'm not on Facebook, about Emily Wilson's translation and the bias of male translators. This is a complicated issue, I guess. I want to say very quickly there are several different issues bundled into this question. One issue is that Emily Wilson is the first woman to ever publish a translation of the Odyssey, and that's fantastic. On the other hand, this concern, like women are being oppressed in this poem by modern translators, and after all, the poor maidservants had to sleep with the suitors because they're slaves and they had no choice. There's actually an issue here of our moral and ethical standards and judgments versus those of an ancient poem, right? I mean, this is a highly patriarchal culture, in some parts of the poem, a very misogynistic culture. I don't think really Odysseus, but Agamemnon in the underworld is a real misogynist. It's a slave owning culture. So we also have to be careful to separate out our own moral judgments. Of course, these are slave women, so they have no choice, versus the way in which this is represented in the poem. What the poem tells us is 12 of the 50 maidservant slaves slept with the suitors. But they didn't just sleep with the suitors. Those of you who've read books 1 to 4, you know from book 2, one of those maidservants ratted out Penelope for the weaving trick. And what we will see in the later books of the Odyssey, and I'll be back to talk about the last 4 books of the Odyssey, which are filled with a lot of very troubling violence. What we'll see in the later books is that they are kind of regarded as traitors within the oikos, within the household. They have betrayed their mistress. They were kind of fifth column or spies for the suitors within the household. So they are punished for that. But also this person asks, Odysseus has these maidservants killed. Was that the correct action? The other thing I would say is that Homer describes, but that doesn't mean he approves. Okay, it's a narrative. We have to decide whether the actions of the characters are morally right or wrong. I think it's a very, very complex text. So my analogy would be, that's scary. If you're reading Henry James and Henry James describes something to you, do you assume he approves everything that he describes in his text? And the same with Homer. We can't necessarily assume that. And part of the point of the reading is that you have to assess for yourselves what's going on. Okay, so that's my quick response to Harry. And as I say, I hope that we can come back to a lot of these issues when we get to the last 4 books of the poem. And probably you'll be discussing these things also with other presenters over the course of the time. But so let me start with what I had wanted to talk about. And I hope I will get through what I had planned for today because, yeah, there's a lot to say, of course. So the first thing I wanted to talk about is just why does the Odyssey start where it does? Because in the proem, the beginning of it on page 73, the translation says at line 10, goddess, start where you will. Just gives the muse a choice. In Greek, it's even more vague. It just says from somewhere here, goddess, tell. So the question is, what is the precipitating cause of our beginning right here, the poem? Now, the very specific local thing is something that Cecily already mentioned, pages 73 to 74. Poseidon has gone off to the Ethiops to enjoy a hecatomb, a big sacrifice, and so the other gods are kind of taking advantage of his absence to make a move. But I would say that's really just a very specific local thing. What really is the precipitating cause of the whole Odyssey, why does it start here, is Telemachus comes of age. Telemachus reaches manhood. This is a crucial transition. And someone also, there's a fantastic question also about this that was sent in advance by Mary. Like, Telemachus is 20 years old. Why is he still sitting around at home? shouldn't he already be a grown up? And that's actually a really good point, because he is in a state of kind of arrested development, Telemachus. Um, and that's very noticeable. But he is right now on the cusp of manhood, right? He was a baby, we're told, when Odysseus left for the Trojan War 20 years ago. And Athena mentions this to Zeus in Book One. Now, the issue here that I want to foreground for the whole first four books is that in ancient Greek culture, the most important value in the culture is the patriline, the continuity and identity from father to son. And one very good bit of evidence for that is a super interesting Homeric naming practice. We know that it happens in Homer. It happens occasionally in later Greek culture, but in Homer, it's a very prominent naming practice, is that you name a son after an attribute of his father. So that is, the son is like just the extension of the father. So, for example, great Ajax from the Iliad, who is famous for his giant shield, he has a son whose name is Eurysakes, broad shield. Or Achilles has a son whose name Neoptolemus, which means young to war or new in war, which is really about Achilles going to war young. Even in our poem, this is something again that Cecily mentioned. Menelaus has a son named Megapenthes, his son by a slave woman, because Helen has only a daughter, Hermione. So there are different, Megapenthes means great grief. This is an attribute of Menelaus. Some people think, Daniel Mendelsohn says, oh, his great grief is that he doesn't have a son by Helen. But I actually think his great grief is Helen. Is like Helen ran off and they had to fight the whole Trojan War. And the son's name then is an attribute of his father. Now, with Telemachus, this is super interesting because Telemachus's name means fighting far away. Okay, which is an attribute of Odysseus. For Telemachus' whole life, he's fighting far away. Or it means fighting from afar, because Odysseus is a bowman, which is actually a kind of devalued and problematic form of warfare, as opposed to face conflict with a sword or a shield. Shooting people from a distance from a bow is kind of looked down on. So, but especially this meaning fighting far away, Telemachus's name, which is an attribute of his father, is also Telemachus's problem. This is Telemachus's dilemma, that his father is far away. So the point is, this continuity in the patriline, which is so important in this culture, means that this is a culture of exemplarity, because it's also a culture that has no formal education system. There's no primary education, there's no secondary education, there's no college, there's no nothing. Basically, sons learn to be like their fathers, to be men by imitating their fathers. But Odysseus has been away for the whole of Telemachus's childhood, fighting far away. That's his name, right? So Telemachus has had no model at all. Laertes, Odysseus's father, his grandfather, has withdrawn and is living like a serf on a different farmstead, a distant farmstead in Ithaca. And this is also an answer to another question. Somebody wrote in, Margaret, where does power lie in Ithaca? Who wields it? Nowhere. Nobody has power in Ithaca. It's a total power vacuum, because Laertes, who really should have stepped up to be in charge when Odysseus was gone, has withdrawn. Telemachus was too young, and Penelope is just kind of trying to hold it all together, but as a woman, she can't rule. So we have a power vacuum in the center of Ithaca. And it's great that several people ask, like, what the hell is going on in Ithaca? Why do they put up with these suitors? Why don't they refuse to serve them? Why don't the people rise up to help for Odysseus's family? The other thing to bear in mind is this is a very primitive pre-modern culture. There is no state. There is no police force. there are just these sort of isolated households. Odysseus is king, but that's obviously a very weak position. And if and this is why this system of guest friendship is so important. Elite men from different places have networks of friends and they help each other. But it's unimaginable that the citizens, the Ithacans, have this sense of identity as Ithacans and are going to rise up to help Odysseus. There is no state. Um, so Sorry, so that's kind of a parenthesis. The point is that Telemachus has no model. Um, and that's a specific issue for Telemachus. But I would say, in fact, there's a more general problem and tension within this culture. On the one hand, as I've said, the continuity and identity within the patriline, fathers to sons, this is the culture's highest value, that continuity from fathers to sons. And yet, on the other hand, remember, again, this is a pre-modern culture. There's no DNA testing. There are no paternity tests. So one thing that Telemachus says early on that I hope you noticed in book one, Athena in the guise of Mentes says, "Oh, you're so big and you look just like Odysseus. You must be his son." And Telemachus responds, this is in Mendelssohn's translation on page 79. "Well then, stranger and friend, I'll tell you straight as I can. My mother says I am his. I myself, however, don't know. For as they say, no one knows his own begetting." Okay, that's kind of an amazing statement. Think about it. But of course, in a pre-modern culture, you know who your mother is. You come out of her. But how do you know who your father is? This is akin to the great African-American critic Skip Gates has this phrase, "Mama's baby, Papa's maybe." This is an issue in this culture. So how can you ever be sure of your paternity? And this is why, as I started to say, exemplarity and being like one's father is so important. In this culture, you come to be by being like, by imitating. And that's the proof of your paternity, not just physical likeness, which I hope you notice all the characters remark on, right? Telemachus looks so much like Odysseus. Nestor says it, Menelaus notices it, Helen says it very explicitly, but not just physical likeness, but likeness of character. And here we need to bear in mind that Odysseus is preeminently the hero of mind, of cunning, of devious tricks. He's a smooth talker and a consummate politician and diplomat. And this is what Telemachus has to learn and grow into to prove that he is his father's son, but also to be ready for the moment of his father's return. And this is why, even though the whole epic is called the Odyssey, the first four books are actually all about Telemachus. This is Margaret's question. This is a coming of age narrative, and this is a crucial moment. As scholars even call the first four books of the Odyssey the Telemachy. He gets his own little narrative arc, right? Basically, Telemachus has to get out of the house, out of the world of women, and have his own adventures, which often parallel in miniature Odysseus's adventures in the fantasy world of books 5 to 12. So that's also something to watch out for, those echoes and parallels. And this is why Athena comes first in the guise of Mentes and then in the guise of mentor. And notice that both of those words have men in the first syllable. Men in Greek here is cognate with Latin manes. It's a mind word. It's from which we get our word mental. That is, these are agent nouns, the one who reminds, the one who brings to mind, the one who brings to consciousness. And that's what Athena is doing for Telemachus. She's bringing Odysseus to Telemachus's consciousness, making him mindful. And her goal here is to guide Telemachus through this transition to adulthood, to help him grow into being the son of Odysseus. And this process also, this is why I love the first four books, is really beautifully and delicately charted through these first four books. I don't have time to walk through all of this in detail, but I would, just mention some high points of this and hope you notice them. So remember that when we first see Telemachus in book one, that's on page 76, if you're reading Mendelssohn, he's just sitting around daydreaming, fantasizing about when his father will come home. He's completely kind of inert and passive. But then toward the end of book one, he has this moment where he kind of asserts himself with Penelope. Penelope comes down and says, please don't sing about the returns. It makes me sad. And Telemachus, for the first time, apparently says, I'm the man of the house. Mine is the power, and sends her back upstairs, right, without a word. That's already, the beginning of this process and this assertion. Then in book two, as Cecily mentioned, right, Telemachus calls an assembly. This is an assertion of adulthood within the wider community, but again, notice, and Cecily pointed this out, there hasn't been an assembly in Ithaca in 20 years since Odysseus left for Troy. So there's no state infrastructure of any kind. Ithaca as a whole is kind of stuck and frozen in this power vacuum. But the other thing I would say about the assembly in book two is that basically the assembly essentially fails. Remember that Telemachus cries and dashes the staff to the ground, the staff that indicates you're the speaker. And then the suitors, especially Antinous, who is the arch baddie of the suitors, whose name means anti-mind, okay, makes fun of Telemachus, and so does Eurymachus, he's like the smoother talker of the suitors. And then the assembly abruptly breaks up with no community action taken, and ends with this prediction by the suitors that Telemachus won't succeed in getting a ship and going anywhere. Then in book three, Telemachus, when he first arrives at Pylos, again, I hope you notice this, he completely lacks confidence, and he doesn't know how to address Nestor. So that Athena, in the guise of mentor, has to say to him, you go right up to him and ask him, it's okay, you'll be all right. He has to mentor him. Whereas, same thing in book four, clearly Pisistratus, the son of Nestor, who's always had his father present, is much more adept at these kind of smooth social interactions, and Telemachus is slowly learning. So that by the end of book four, when Menelaus says, oh, I'd like to keep you here for 11 or 12 days, and then I'm going to give you 3 horses and a chariot and this and that, Telemachus is able to say, this is on pages 133 to 134, if you're reading the Mendelssohn translation, don't give me horses. Ithaca's no good for horses. Just give me, something that I can carry with me. And I really need to leave. But he's learned how to talk. And Menelaus's response is to praise him. Dear boy, the things you say show you're of solid stock. This is in Greek, literally, you're of good blood. You are your father's son, the way you have spoken to me. His speech, Telemachus, at this point, Telemachus' speech and reasoning toward the end of book four prove he is Odysseus' son. So we have to see all that before we even get to see Odysseus. That is also a response. Somebody else asked, well, what's the deal? Why don't we get to see Odysseus? Like, people are always talking about him, but where is he? This is why first, we have to go through this arc with Telemachus, I think. Then the other thing I wanted to talk about also, very briefly, because it's one of my favorite things in the Odyssey, and somebody asked about this too, is the relationship of Helen and Menelaus in book four. Because the other thing I would say about the Odyssey is very interested in the question of marriage and how a marriage works, and specifically this marriage of Odysseus and Penelope, which has to be kind of rebuilt, and they have to forge or reforge this very important bond. They are very well matched because they're both all about cunning intelligence and intellect. And you'll see that happening over the course of the poem. But the poem also, in order to think about the relationship of Odysseus and Penelope, is always lining them up against other married couples. I think somebody asked about this. Yeah, Margaret. For example, Agamemnon and Clytemnestra, not a good marriage, obviously, right? But a story of Agamemnon's return, and Clytemnestra, his wife, is having an adulterous affair with Aegisthus, and they kill Agamemnon when he comes home. This is a story that's narrated 11 times in the course of the Odyssey as this kind of comparison to Odysseus and Penelope. But another parallel is the marriage of um, Helen and Menelaus that we see in Book 4, which on the face of it seems like it's a happy marriage, right? They wind up in bed together. She's doing her, making her wool. It's all very cozy and domestic. But as Cecily's already pointed your attention to, there are a lot of kind of very weird things going on here. Yeah. So I just want to talk about those a little. Remember that Helen, of course, was the original cause of the Trojan War in Homer's account. She ran off with Paris, or rather, we don't know. One person had a question about her being kidnapped, but actually, the ancient sources are completely ambiguous about whether Helen chose to run off with Paris or was carried off by force by him. It's never clear. But a lot of the sources impute to her the choice. She ran off with him out of desire for Paris, who's very attractive. So she's the cause of the Trojan War. She ran off with Paris. The Greeks came after her, this great marshaled army, and waged a war for 10 years to get her back. Now, what we're shown in Book 4 is this very peculiar kind of domesticity, right? Remember that Menelaus and his guests, Telemachus and Pisistratus, the son of Nestor, begin weeping and mourning as they're remembering all the figures who died in the Trojan War because of Helen. And at that point, Helen slips a drug into their wine, right? A drug that causes painlessness, nepenthes. You don't feel any grief. And the description of it on page 122 is kind of amazing, because what it says is you wouldn't feel grief or cry even if you saw your mother and your father dead in front of you, or if some people came and killed your brother or your son. You wouldn't feel any grief. So this is a bizarre drug that Helen has, which causes the most intimate familial bonds to be kind of forgotten or ignored, right? That's already something weird. And then, as Cecily mentioned, each of them proceeds to tell a story. First, Helen, having drugged the wine, tells this story about how Odysseus slipped into Troy, disguising himself as a beggar on a reconnaissance mission, and only she recognized him. And Menelaus responds then with a story on page 124 about Odysseus keeping them all silent in the Trojan horse, right? Now, ostensibly, both of these are stories about Odysseus, his craftiness, his courage, his endurance. But notice that they are also stories that convey competing, even contradictory messages about Helen's loyalty and her allegiance. Helen's story claims that long before the fall of Troy, she regretted running off with Paris and wanted to return to Menelaus and the Greeks, and therefore she helped Odysseus. That's what she claims, right? And he killed a bunch of Trojans, and the Trojan women mourned, but she was happy that he'd killed a bunch of Trojans. That's what she says. Now, Menelaus responds with a story about Helen's giving very material aid to the Trojans at the latest point in the war, when they're in the Trojan horse. hiding in the Trojan horse so they can sack the city. And notice also that Menelaus just casually mentions Helen's second Trojan husband, Deiphobus. So even after Paris is killed in the war, she took a second Trojan husband. So much for missing Menelaus and wanting to go back home, right? So many modern scholars have been quick to take this exchange between Helen and Menelaus then as simply she's telling a false story and Menelaus is telling a true story, right? I mean, she's trying to make herself look better by claiming she regretted running off to Troy and that she wanted to come home. But I would say it's not quite so simple. There's a way in which these stories need each other. They actually interdepend. Because how does Helen know about the plot with the horse? How does she know they're in the horse? She has told us that Odysseus in disguise, once she swore an oath that she wouldn't give him away, quote, laid out the Achaeans' entire plan. Does that mean he told her about the Trojan horse? Is it so? That is to say, what Helen figures here in the two stories, as elsewhere in the Greek tradition, by the way, I would say, is the radical unknowability of the woman, right? What the woman wants, what her allegiance is, um, and whether she speaks true or false. It's also really striking. I hope you noticed this, but maybe you didn't because it goes by very quickly. Almost Helen's first words on page 120, she says, "Oh, who are these strangers?" Then she says, "Shall I dissemble or shall I tell the truth? Shall I lie or shall I tell the truth?" she asks. And she never tells you which she's saying. So everything Helen says is under the sign, under the aegis of this question: shall I dissemble or shall I tell the truth? Um, so among the many things that are going on with Helen, it suggests and remember also, what does she do with the horse? She walks around the horse, she kind of massages the belly of the horse, and she calls out using the voice of each of the Achaeans' wives, right? Remember that on page 124. She's able to imitate the voices of each of the wives of the Achaeans who are hiding in the horse, trying to get them to give themselves away. And this also goes along with this. Is she telling the truth? Is she lying? The complete unknowability of the woman. It suggests the woman's changeability, shape-shifting ability to imitate. And notice that after Menelaus says that she called out using the voices of all the wives, calling us by name, he says, Diomedes and I wanted to start up. So that means she's also calling out using the voice of the wife of Menelaus. That is herself. Okay, Helen. But weirdly, is she herself or is she an imitation? She's imitating, among the many things she's imitating, is her own voice. It calls into question the distinction between reality, authenticity, and mimesis. This is the problem with the woman. I mean, Helen, quintessentially. And I would also say, just by way of wrapping up, it's this radical unknowability. I would suggest to you that Helen, in this radical unknowability, Helen presents a prospect as disturbing as Clytemnestra, right? The unambiguously unfaithful wife, but also that for the Odyssey, Helen figures something else as well. All the potential for narrative, for storytelling, all the ambiguities of narrative. And if the Odyssey is about storytelling, which it absolutely is, you should watch for all the narratives that Odysseus tells about himself over the course of the poem. this little exchange between Helen and Menelaus offers us an important paradigm for storytelling, the uncertain ground, the unknowability between story and truth. Um, so she's this profoundly double figure, Helen. She always is in the Greek tradition, but a figure who represents this problem of mimesis, of imitation, of doubling, of whether you can ever know the woman at all. And then, of course, they just go to bed together, right? We get those two lines of, oh, and then they're in bed together. That's the end of Helen and Menelaus. But watch for Helen also, because Helen will come back. We'll see a little bit more of Helen in book 15. The other thing, I mean, I have to say my favorite character in the first four books is Helen, of course. The other thing I hope you noticed is she, like Menelaus is totally outclassed here. Menelaus is pondering, should he ask Telemachus? He kind of thinks Telemachus is the son of Odysseus. Helen zooms right in there and she's like, oh, he's the son of Odysseus. And she'll do exactly the same thing in book 15, where there's an omen, a bird omen, and Telemachus and Pisistratus are like, oh, Menelaus, what does it mean? And Helen will be like, I'll tell you what it means. Like, she's always in there first. She's much smarter than Menelaus. Who's, affable and very wealthy, but kind of clueless. And she has these kind of powers as storyteller, as seer, as visionary that are, really uncanny. Because the other thing to bear in mind about Helen is that Helen is the only daughter of Zeus, an immortal woman. Zeus sleeps with a lot of mortal women and produces a lot of male heroes. Heracles, Perseus, yeah, there are millions of them. I can't even list them all. Okay, but there's only one daughter. That's Helen. And she's this very mysterious figure, daughter by Zeus and a mortal woman. And so it's also really important when in the poem when she's referred to as Helen born from Zeus. That's of course another way in which Menelaus is totally outclassed. He's really married above himself, and you know that also because Proteus says to him, you're going to go to the Isles of the Blessed because you're the son-in-law of Zeus. And it doesn't really register for Menelaus. He's more upset about the fact that his brother Agamemnon has been murdered. He doesn't really comment on this thing about going to the Isles of the Blessed. But it's again, like, that's a really good marriage. He's doing very well out of it. So yeah, I guess I would say this is why Helen for me is my favorite character in books 1 to 4. So I'm going to stop there. I'm happy to take questions, though maybe it's impossible with this larger
Yeah.
group.
Thank you so much. And I'm seeing some questions roll in, and one actually happens to be about Helen, and the translation on page 120,
Mhm.
line 146, when she calls herself a shameless bitch.
Oh, yeah.
There's a lot of discussion in the chat about, how close is this to the Greek and
Yeah, I think it's
how do we think
kunopis.
about this? Okay.
Yeah, in Greek, it's, for the sake of me, moi or kunopidos, dog-faced. Um, so bitch in the sense of female dog is correct. For the
Right.
Greeks, she calls herself a bitch, both here and in the Iliad. And the general idea when we see this insult of someone being a dog or a bitch is it's generally understood to be a figure for shamelessness. The dog is shameless. Various theories of why the Greeks think the dog is shameless. I think it's because it licks its own butt in public. But there's a whole interesting literature on like why the Greeks think of the dog as shameless, but that's what it means. And so also, and we know that because like Achilles also insults Agamemnon at the beginning of the Iliad by calling him dog-faced. You're shameless. you do things that are totally inappropriate and you have no shame. So that's the reason for that translation. All for me, a shameless bitch is kind of
Yeah.
unpacking the kuon, the kunopidos, dog faced. Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. I think helpful for everyone. And I'm seeing another question from Yi Shang about how we understand the parallels between Helen and Odysseus. And I think you were touching on
Yeah.
storytelling as one of them, but maybe there are other things that you want people to be on the lookout for as we go on, or
Yeah, I mean, definitely storytelling and also trickery. I mean, she's a great trickster as he is, and has the power with drugs might remind you of that super interesting thing that gets said in book one. What
Mhm.
Athena says is almost the first thing she says about Odysseus is he's a guest friend. He had gone to Ephyrat to get poison for his arrows, but Ilos, the son of Mermeros, wouldn't give him the poison, but my father, because he loved him so terribly, gave him the poison. So, uh, and that's an amazing thing to say, right? Because he says Ilos, the son of Mermeros, wouldn't give him the poison because he feared the wrath of Zeus. Because arrows are bad enough fighting from a distance, but shooting poison arrows at your enemies is really, really bad. Okay, but so it's about baneful drugs. And of course, Helen is also the mistress of drugs.
Mm.
So there's that. And of course, also that whole scene of her story of Odysseus coming into Troy, having disfigured himself and as a beggar, prefigures and anticipates the whole Ithaca, the second half of the poem in Ithaca, where he is in disguise as a beggar to test his household and to test the suitors and to return in secret. The other thing I also always find fascinating about her narrative is the kind of erotic frisson
Mm.
between her and Odysseus, because she bathes him
Right.
and dresses him. And, people are always getting bathed in the Odyssey. It's part of this guest host thing. The first thing you do is you bring someone in, you give them a bath, you feed them, and only then do you ask them their name and their business. But it's a very kind of private, intimate moment there between Helen and Odysseus. So I don't know, I always think there's some interesting little thing going on there.
Right. Like they're somehow able to see each other in a very unique way.
Yeah, no,
Yeah.
exactly. And actually, that's interesting because in the Iliad, Helen and Achilles are kind of paired because
Mm.
he's singing the Androne, he's singing the Fames of Men, which is of course epic, and weaving she's weaving a purple web that has the Iliad in it. She's weaving the narrative. So people like to say that Helen in the Iliad is a kind of poet figure, as is Achilles.
Mm.
And so here she's also a kind of both a poet figure and a storyteller,
Mhm.
as Odysseus is, and very good at shape changing and mimesis, which of course Odysseus is also very good at that.
Right.
Yeah.
That's great. Another kind of related question, this is from Leslie in the Q&A section,
Oh yeah.
is about Penelope and her relationship to the suitors, which of course weaving is involved
Yeah.
in.
Yeah.
So, why would Penelope be leading on the suitors in this?
Yeah, no,
What's
this is really
happening?
it's a complicated question. It goes back to what I was saying. I mean, again, your guess is as good as mine, right? Like we have the text and we have to just make sense of it. Homer describes, but he doesn't tell us people's motivations normally. He just describes their actions. Um, I think I think the thing with Penelope is given that there is no state and there is no protection, she's in a very precarious position.
Mhm.
She wants to maintain the household and protect her son, Telemachus, and she wants to maintain the household and the household wealth for Telemachus. And she also is not ready to give up on Odysseus as dead,
Right.
in which case she would have to go back to the house of her father, Icarios, and be married off again to somebody else. So she is doing a very complicated dance of letting the suitors just like hang out in her house and eat her out of house and home rather than have them force her to do something, force her to marry, kill her son. I mean, there are
Mhm.
108 of them and they have no protection.
Right.
So she's just engaged in stalling tactics. And by allowing them to think that it could happen, this marriage, she keeps them from actual violence. That would be my read of it. But, as I say, you've read the poem. What do you think is going on? It's very murky.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think Jack Winkler has this thing about how she's also using their gifts to kind of
Yeah,
replenish the stores. So
that's
yeah,
right.
it's
Yeah,
kind of
because we do have this funny description later where she gets them all to give gifts, and Odysseus, it's in the second half, Odysseus in disguise as a beggar rejoices in his heart,
Mhm.
which seems a little odd, right? Like you think he might be jealous, but he knows that what she's doing is replenishing the wealth of the household. So he's happy about it. Yeah, I mean it's a very complicated system, and she clearly is just worried, eh, rightly so, obviously, that they are going to kill her son,
Hmm.
Telemachus, and just loot the property, which they could easily do, right? The Ithacans don't seem motivated to intervene or to stop them,
Right,
right?
right.
So yeah, I mean, I saw those questions, and it's very hard to answer, but I do think it's about like, what do you do in a situation where there's a power vacuum and you're under siege? You're threatened, but you're just a woman and a boy.
Right. Yeah, I'm just checking here to see. We did have a question that was jumping back a little bit to just the idea of performance. And I don't know how much like let me find how much it was referring to. This is Amy's question about bards and imagining performance and what it would have looked like and what memory was like.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess that's one question. I guess bards or kind of the actual rhapsodes performing.
Mm-hmm.
How did we think about their memorization and what they were doing? But that question also made me think about all the bards that we get in these four books and
Yeah.
what's up with the bard that was guarding Clytemnestra and how
Oh
do we
yeah,
think
poor
about
right, that poor
Fabian's
guy.
part of that? So I don't know if there's some comments about
Yeah.
bards in
Yeah, I
general
don't know.
or
I mean, that's also a whole complicated thing about like bards and their memories that gets us into the whole like oral formulaic theory and how they composed. Was it completely oral or did they have some writing? So the general idea is that it's not about memorization in our sense, but someone so trained in this tradition that has all these prefab phrases. My analogy is like the Lego block poem, right? Like you snap in Lego blocks, metrical phrases of different metrical shapes that are prefab, but the poet has been brought up in this culture, apprenticed in this culture, and completely steeped in this culture, so that it's not that he's memorized 20,000 lines, but that he can compose orally using these pre-made metrical units, and knows how to improvise. And so every performance is actually different, and um, there's no gap between composition and performance. He's
Mhm.
composing as he's performing, and the formulaic system allows him to do that fluently. That's what we think.
Right.
So it's not like our idea of memorization. Like I was taught Greek a long time ago by a woman who told us that she had memorized the first book of Paradise Lost.
Mm.
And we were like, wow, that's really long. Nobody could memorize that today. And so I think there is one way of thinking about Homer, that somehow he just has this prodigious memory, and probably he does have a prodigious memory. If there's no writing, you have to. But but it's not like our system of memorization,
Mhm.
I think. And as for the bards, yeah, I do have to mention, I don't know, there's so many cool modern rewritings of the Odyssey, but you're
Mm.
mentioning the bard, the poor guy whom Agamemnon left behind to watch, Clytemnestra,
Right.
always reminds me of there's a set of stories by John Barth.
Mm.
John Barth was a favorite author of mine when I was like in high school. And he died pretty recently, but he was also obsessed with narrative and stories. So he has a collection of stories called Lost in the Funhouse, um, in which one of the stories is written from the perspective of that bard marooned on a desert island. And the bard's name is Anonymous. It's actually a brilliant story. And he has another one called the Menelaad, which
Mm.
is his version of Menelaus holding on to Proteus, which has this set of nested narratives, so that there are like 7 nested inset narratives within narratives within narratives that all get resolved at the same time, because his kind of, sort of postmodern fantasy of that problem of Menelaus holding on to Proteus is that Proteus turns into Menelaus holding on to Proteus, so that Menelaus ever afterwards is never sure that he actually exists.
Mm.
But yeah, no, I love that bard with Clytemnestra, because why would you trust your wife to a bard? It doesn't
Right.
make any sense. Yeah.
Yeah. It seems so strange, especially. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um,
Anyway, I think I'm out of time,
yes.
but
So thank you so much, Professor Kirk,
yeah,
for
and I will
getting us
come back
started.
for the last 4 books, and I hope then we will be able to talk, we'll have to talk more about this, the problem of violence in the poem.
Right. So now the breakout rooms will open, so you can have more discussion with different members of the group. They're divided based on themes, so join whichever one you would like. So those will open now, I believe.
So thanks, Cecily. I'll see you.
Thanks.